when you're hearing someone else's opinion on a person or on a group of people, you've also got their biases and all the filters that information is coming through. If you rely on clear-cut message that doesn't take into account the consequences to them, for instance, and they will remember how that's made them feel and they won't be happy about it. Hi, I'm Emma Dutton. I'm one of the co-founders of the Applied Influence Group.
And I'm Fahey. I'm a Vice President of Legal Affairs at Inmarsat. And we're here today to talk about influencing negotiations. Lawyers are often called on to achieve an outcome from negotiations, whether with a supplier or a customer or a partner. What advice would you give someone about how to influence the outcome?
Excellent question. So I think it's clear to understand what we mean when we say influence. So to us, what we mean on an individual level is how are we trying to change someone's mind about something? How are we trying to change a decision, a behaviour, someone's perspective on an issue or on the world in general? And it's important to know that you've got a much better chance of doing that with someone the better a relationship you have. That's a really obvious point, of course, but there is hundreds of thousands of years worth of evolution that's gone into that. So a lot of the work that goes in the room should be done prior to being in the room, and the better prepared you are, the better chance you're going to give yourself to build those relationships to be more influential in the room. So we're all hardwired to be influenced by and favour those who are like us and with whom we share a sense of identity, right? So if you can do some research and preparation beforehand into understanding those common points of connection with someone, the better chance you've got of them liking you, and therefore that can lead to trust. It's important to do a bit of research and what we call, at Applied Influence, we call profiling on a person, and that's not being a stalker and following them home at night. It's just understanding what authentic common connection points you have with a person and then appropriately hooking onto those when appropriate in the room. And so the more you can share an understanding of a person or individuals that you're having a meeting with, the more you can share an understanding with other people on your side, the better, and the richer picture, the more perspectives you have. So having a common framework for profiling a person is really important. So having a sense of people's interests, their likes and dislikes, their preferences for things, how they like to receive their information, how they like their meetings to run. Are you going to really annoy someone if you're 5 minutes late? Do you need to make sure you're there 10 minutes early? Or are you making a good point by arriving? So having a really good understanding of someone's preferences for things that are relevant in that meeting is really important, and sharing that information across the team, because quite often we find that people have most of the answers between them in their heads. They just don't often share it.
What would be a good way of finding those information points out? So often I'd be called into a meeting and say, I'm expected to get an outcome, but I've not even met the people before. Yeah. I might have found out a couple of days beforehand and the team said, we've got a negotiation, we've got to go in. So how would you go about building those that picture about people?
Well, really good source of information is your own interactions with them and other people's interactions with them. So getting other people's perspectives in relation to, again, their interests, their likes and dislikes, how they're motivated, common connections, common people between you, that's really important. But obviously be careful when you're hearing someone else's opinion on a person or on a group of people. You've also got their biases and all the filters that information is coming through. Social media is really good. The watch out here, of course, is that people like to project a certain image of themselves on social media, but that in itself can be really interesting and tell you a lot about how that person wants to be perceived. That might give you a sense of certain influence messaging that you can use, and might give you a sense of how they're motivated. Planning, there's a couple of key questions I'd recommend that we ask ourselves and ask of each other when we're preparing for high stakes meetings. The first one is, so how are we trying to change someone's thoughts, feelings, behaviours, decision about specific issues? So what's what we call frame or their perspective? So it's sort of like the human bit. So quite often we plan for our objectives, our meeting objectives, in terms of what does that mean in terms of numbers or negotiation boundaries or something. But in terms of the people, what are we trying to change about them? To be clear about that. And then have a think and be clear about amongst you what are the things we know about that person that are useful to help us do that. So at some point, is it useful for me to mention, oh, we went to Loughborough University together, I must have graduated a year after you, isn't that cool? And immediately you're starting to generate a sense of shared identity which gives you a much better chance of building some trust. And then ask yourself some key questions around what might go wrong, what might go right, and what's the most likely thing to happen. And what you're doing there is you're preloading all the cognitive burden on thinking through how we're going to react to those things. So one, it will mean that everyone's aware of how we're all going to react in that situation, and two, it means you've already thought about it.
Occasionally in negotiations, you'll have a person in there who can undermine the relationship you're trying to build up, or the atmosphere you're trying to create. And that could be on the other side, or it could be someone in your own team. It could be for a number of reasons. But how do you try to manage that person within a meeting so you don't derail the conversation?
So if someone's being difficult or sort of hostile, is that what you mean?
You might find someone who's been hostile because they don't like you as a supplier or a customer.
Yeah.
You might find there's someone on your team who didn't like the person who's been down selected, but that's the party that you're going with, the decision's gone above you. You still need to get an achieved outcome, but that person's blocking the conversation or making it more difficult.
Yeah, that can be really tricky, and I think it depends if they're in your side of it or the other side, if it's a genuine emotional reaction that's causing that hostility, potentially aggression, or whether it's a deliberate attempt to derail it. That can all determine, I think, how you react to it. I think the thing to bear in mind, if it's a genuine, slightly hostile or aggressive reaction to something, no matter who it is, generally as humans we'll react in that way to something when there's a vulnerability of some kind, when we're trying to protect a vulnerability, right? If it's someone on your own side, your own team, and unbeknownst to you, they suddenly come up with a hostile response to something, or you can see that they're getting an emotional reaction in the room, taking them outside, having a 5 minutes to understand why that is a really good thing to do, and using questions like, so tell me what's going on right now. So tell, explain, describe are all what we call narrative questions, TED, and what you're doing is you're commanding them. Really, it's a command. Tell me what's going on right now, but in a really empathetic way.
So taking them out of that situation for a moment, trying to break down the walls and see what you can do about it. Do you have any tips for lawyers when they're in negotiations and they've got to give a bad message to someone, or a simple no, but do it in a way which doesn't undermine their credibility or derail the negotiations?
Yeah, so I think it's important to understand what we mean by credibility and break that down. And I think there's a difference as well between personal credibility and that of the brand or the thing behind you that you're representing. So with personal credibility, we think about that in three ways, or having three dimensions to it. So firstly, it's about expertise and how you're demonstrating expertise. Secondly, it's about dynamism, so how that's done, how that's projected. And thirdly, it's about truthfulness, which is really about authenticity and doing what you say. So if you can deliver some bad news in a way that is credible using those three components of it, then that's a good start. So if you can demonstrate that and evidence why that is the case, so you're demonstrating your expertise, and it might be that's evidence with some sort of logic or some sort of data, but it's also delivered in a dynamic way that is not necessarily, I'm really excited about this bad news that I've got to tell you, but it's about eye contact, it's about what's going on in your face, and it might be that you're expressing a bit of empathy, and I'm also annoyed about this. I can understand why this would be, but it's done in there's some enthusiasm and concern, some expression behind it. And then truthfulness is really about the authenticity of it, and it's really about doing what you say you're going to do. So in terms of delivering a bad message, there are three components to bear in mind, and also on an unconscious level, we're all sort of assessing for that in other people as well. So we might not understand it in that clear way, but we are constantly assessing people for those three things. Yeah. It's also important to remember that 6 months later, after that meeting, the chances are people are not going to remember what you said or what the content was, but they will remember how you made them feel, because we're humans, that's what we do, we remember how we feel about things much later on. So just remember that. So it's important to use some really good listening and elicitation techniques. Remember what's going on in your face, making sure you're being authentic about it, but if you can project to someone that you're understanding why they might be annoyed or experiencing an emotional reaction to the bad news you've got to deliver, but you make them feel like there's a reason for that. You understand, you're empathising with why that is and why that they're feeling the way that they are. Then they will remember how you make them feel. Whereas if you rely on facts alone, if you rely on a clear-cut message that doesn't take into account the consequences to them, for instance, and they will remember how that's made them feel and they won't be happy about it. So if you want a long-term relationship with the people that you're engaging with, then always remember how they're going to be feeling about that in 6 months' time.